Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. We're going to give this a couple minutes. I see the numbers sort of trickling in right now. All right, so it's 1:02. I think we can sort of start with these introductions before we get to the main programming today. So welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining our Sargassum webinar series. We launched this series to raise awareness about key issues surrounding Sargassum. So this is our third webinar, and each webinar highlights different aspects of Sargassum research, management, and impacts that Sargassum has on coastal communities and ecosystems. Some of those impacts are pictured here in this infographic. The goal of this series is really to foster knowledge sharing and regional collaboration across affected areas as we continue to sort of see impacts from Sargassum inundation events. My name's Max, and I'm a contractor working with NCOS as a program analyst. I have a background in phytoplankton, coastal ecology, and molecular biology. I started working on sargassum management last year and helped pull together an assessment of the federal policy landscape. Following that, I helped organize and convene a workshop identifying research gaps related to sargassum management. This webinar series is presented by NOAA's Southeast and Caribbean Regional Collaboration Team, also known as SECART. SECART is one of 8 regional collaboration teams that are currently working across the country, working with NOAA staff and partners to bring together collaborative ties in an effort to improve regional capabilities and services. I'm going to post a link in the chat, or Josie is going to post a link in the chat about SECART so you can find some more information there. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So here are the webinars that are taking place during the series, and like I said, today's our third webinar out of 5. If you scan that QR code on the top, it'll take you to a website where you can view descriptions of each webinar and register for them. Josie's also going to put that link in the chat for you as well. So as I alluded to, with me today is Josie Galloway, who's also with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS.
Thanks, Max. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. As Max said, I work for NCOS, and one of my primary roles is serving as the Executive Secretary for the Interagency Working Group on Harmful Algal Blooms and Hypoxia Research and Control, and this committee sits under the National Science and Technology Council. In my role, I help to coordinate with federal agencies to develop strategies to research, prevent, control, and mitigate the impacts of HABs, including sargassum. Over the past year, I've helped Max with the policy assessment and to convene interagency scientists to help with different webinar series and workshops related to sargassum. I am going to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, all participants are muted during the presentation, but you can send your questions to us in the question chat box, and we will try to answer them at the end. Second, due to a large number of participants, some of the slides might be delayed. And finally, we are recording this webinar, and we will put the link to watch on our website after the series ends. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And Jose, if you don't mind, starting to pull yours up. And then while you do that, I'll introduce you. So today, you're good. So today's webinar is presented by Jose Martínez, and the title is Multifaceted Impacts of Sargassum Accumulation Events on Coasts and Coastal Communities. Jose Martínez is a Knaus Fellow at the House of Representatives working on energy, environment, and Puerto Rico issues. He received a master's in chemical oceanography from the University of Puerto Rico Mayagüez, where he completed his thesis titled Hypoxia-Driven by Caribbean Sargassum Accumulation Events. He is particularly interested in the intersection of climate change, environmental challenges, and policy, demonstrated by his master's thesis and his current role as a Knaus Fellow. Jose is committed to sustainable coastal and ocean management and increasing the role of science in policy making. And with that, Jose, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Joyce and Max. Really appreciate y'all. And just want to say hi to everyone who's watching. Thank you for coming today. Again, my name is José Martínez. I want to thank NOAA SECART in general for hosting these webinars on sargassum. It's a huge issue, but I think deserves all the attention that it needs, and for inviting me to give this webinar. And so I appreciate the introduction as well, Josie. Really great. So today, let's jump into the multifaceted impacts of sargassum accumulation events on coasts and coastal communities. Starting off with but we'll do an introduction. So sargassum is more than just a seaweed. It's a floating ecosystem. Unlike most algae that grow on the seafloor, this golden brown macroalgae drifts in open water, forming dense mats that support an incredible diversity of life. As you see here, pictured here on the right, it can be shelter for young sea turtles and other species, nurseries for several species, including commercial fish like tuna and mahi-mahi, and they can be feeding grounds for seabirds and even dolphins. And so for centuries, sargassum was primarily found in the Sargasso Sea, at least in the Atlantic, which is a unique current-bound region of the Central Atlantic on top of Bermuda, I believe, and of course around the Central Atlantic. But in the last decade or so, something has changed, and so let's take a look at how this algae has expanded beyond its historic range. Since 2011, scientists have tracked a reoccurring belt of sargassum in the equatorial Atlantic that they call the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, which stretches over 5,000 miles from West Africa to the Caribbean, becoming a game changer for these coastal ecosystems in the region, right? You can see here pictured on the right, the Sargasso Sea that I mentioned. Below it in the equatorial Atlantic, you see the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, and you see all the various currents surround both Sargasso Sea and the Sargassum Belt. And there are three main factors that likely fuel these blooms that I will mention here. Rising ocean temperatures, which can boost the growth of sargassum, and then agricultural runoff from the Amazon, the Congo rivers, and maybe even the Mississippi, can feed these blooms, and then as well as potentially nutrient-rich water being upwelled or brought up from the deep off the coast of West Africa. And sargassum can spread via these ocean currents that you see pictured there on the right, which carry like the north equatorial current, which can carry sargassum westward, dumping it on Caribbean and Gulf Coast beaches. But there's a critical point that I want to make, is that unlike sargassum in the Sargasso Sea, this new belt is relatively unstable. It breaks apart and can invade coasts. Oh, sorry about that. Quickly, I do want to go over the benefits that sargassum provides, because it's crucial to recognize their ecological value. As far offshore, these sargassum mats are like they're teeming with life, and they're fairly irreplaceable for marine biodiversity. They serve as a mobile nursery, in normal amounts. It provides habitat, food, protection, breeding grounds for hundreds of species, including sea turtles, flying fish, and commercially vital species like tuna and swordfish. They serve they can serve as the base of a food web, or the food web in terms of that can help support predators like dolphins and billfish. They are so important, especially for endangered species, that the United States has designated it as an essential fish habitat, meaning it has a legal recognition of its role in sustaining species, especially endangered ones, like I mentioned, and fisheries. And likely without it, fish populations would collapse from the Gulf to the Caribbean. And it could also be a carbon sequestrator, but it hasn't been studied as much in that role. But it could prove significant later on when we talk about the ways that we can respond to the sargassum accumulation events. But the balance is fragile, right? So when sargassum overwhelms coasts, the same traits that make it beneficial offshore, rapid growth, dense mats, can become destructive. But first, I do want to talk about the kinds of ecosystems that we're going to be talking about that get in the way of sargassum accumulation events, right? Sargassum's impacts can ripple through the foundations of our tropical coasts. These critical ecosystems sustain marine life and fisheries. Ecosystems like coral reefs, they're biodiversity hotspots, attracting fish for fisheries. They are ecotourism drivers. They provide wave and storm protection, seagrasses as well, and filter pollutants and can improve the water quality. Seagrasses can also sequester carbon. They support biodiversity as well, and they also provide coastal protection. Mangroves as well, they are really known for their coastal protection. They reduce erosion, buffer against storm waves and tsunamis. I know I have a friend that talks about putting his boat by the mangroves when the storm comes. So they are very important. And then mangroves also sequester carbon, and they serve as nursery habitats, for critical breeding and feeding grounds for fish, crabs, and other marine species. And I also want to shout out one that I didn't include on this slide because it didn't fit and it didn't look right, but our salt marshes. They're habitats for seabirds and are also an important habitat that could be impacted, or that can be impacted by sargassum. And then each of these ecosystems is again vital for coastal resilience, fisheries, and climate regulations. And now I want to get more into the mechanisms that occur when sargassum accumulates onshore. So when these massive sargassum mats reach coast, they can look like this picture here I took on the right from my thesis. This is a picture of a sargassum accumulation event or a sargassum inundation event. I'm going to be using those terms interchangeably. And this is a picture of an SIE or a sargassum accumulation event in La Palguera, Puerto Rico. And so sargassum doesn't just pile up, they trigger ecological and economic crises, but we're going to start with the ecological aspects of the environmental aspects. So the mat of sargassum itself can block sunlight and increase temperatures acutely in the area. The blocking of sunlight prevents photosynthesis, and as well as the sargassum begins to decompose and a large amount of oxygen is also consumed because it brings in a lot of organic matter, which can create hypoxic or low oxygen conditions that can suffocate fish and other marine animals. Also, within 48 hours, decomposition releases a substance called hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxic gas that smells like rotten eggs. It can harm human health and corrode infrastructure. This is not just unsightly, it's a full-blown environmental hazard. And the damage doesn't stop at the shoreline. When sargassum accumulates, it can fuel another threat, something called a sargassum brown tide. So when these sargassum inundation events happen, it can trigger these SBTs as that organic matter I mentioned earlier, both as the sargassum comes in and as it decomposes, it releases a lot of particulate organic matter, which can turn clear waters, as you see pictured here on the right, a typical nearshore ecosystem with seagrasses, corals, and fish. That particulate organic matter can turn it into a turbid brown soup, which we can see here, picture with the next picture. You see the beach cat sargassum on the beach, you see it accumulated in the nearshore, and then you see that it becomes much more brown. And that SBT is what we call that, can extend up to 100 meters offshore. And again, not just a direct accumulation, but the SBT can block sunlight, thus blocking photosynthesis, and thus there's no oxygen production on top of the amount of respiration occurring, can cause hypoxia, which induces stress on corals and other marine life in the ecosystem. And this is similar to what we call a eutrophication event, where a large amount of organic matter comes in and can impact the ecosystems. And this can cause mortality, seagrasses and other marine animals that could take decades to recover, if they recover at all, given that we've seen that these sargassum accumulation events can happen seasonally, or at least happen at least every season or so, every year. And so I do want to get more in detail, more granular on the kind of chemistry that's going on here. And so this figure here on the left is similar to the figure we saw earlier. It has section A being direct accumulation, while B represents more of a Sargassum brown tide, and then C is the back reef area without any visible particulate organic matter. And the figure here on the right, we have spatial data of dissolved oxygen around a Sargassum accumulation event, I believe in the Mexican Caribbean. And you have distance to shore on the x-axis, and then you have dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter on the y-axis. And so the takeaway I want you to have from this figure is that as you move further away from shore, you see higher oxygen concentrations, and as you apologies, you get closer to shore, you have lower oxygen concentrations, even reaching close to hypoxia in some cases. And so I want to dive a little deeper into why that occurs, why we see diminished hypoxia under Sargassum accumulation event. So, like I mentioned earlier, or I might not have mentioned this, but the Sargassum season occurs from around April, May to August, September in the Caribbean, which coincides with summer, the hottest time of the year. And so with this figure here on the right, you see dissolved oxygen concentrations on the vertical axis, and then temperature on the x-axis. And you see that as temperatures increase, the concentration of dissolved oxygen decreases. This is because as a warmer body of water can hold less oxygen due to the solubility of oxygen decreasing as temperatures increase. Next figure I want to show you is this figure, which has rate of reaction or rate of respiration on the vertical axis and temperature on the x-axis. And so the takeaway that I want you to have from this figure especially is that as you increase temperatures, you increase the rate of respiration of organisms, meaning that in a hotter body of water, organisms on average consume more oxygen. And the way I like to think about it is that if you were to run outside in the heat versus running inside with air conditioning, you're going to consume more oxygen. You're going to expend more energy outside in 90-degree weather rather than 60 degrees or 70 degrees in an air conditioner. And the same applies to the fish and other respirating organisms in a body of water. So this combines with global warming and the acute raise of temperature that the mat has been shown to do, and so it creates like a combined effect that increases the risk of hypoxia, which can cause fish kills, like how this fish kill occurred in Mexico. I think not too long ago. I think I pulled this picture from. I think the article said it was the beginning of this month. So we see that these Sargassum accumulation events are, happening right now as we speak, or at least they may be. Moving on in a bit more detail, the impacts, I want to first go over the biophysical impacts and the manifestation of how that happens. And so I've shown you how summer or Sargassum influx combined with warming can fuel hypoxia and fish kills, but the damage does not stop there. The repeated eutrophication events can trigger cascading ecosystem phase shifts, essentially moving from one style of ecosystem to another. As you see here pictured on the right, a coral reef can possibly turn into an algae bed if pushed hard enough, push being a subjective term there, but if pushed hard enough by the Sargassum accumulation, we've seen similar things happen in the Mexican Caribbean where seagrass mortality, led to that loss, and you just have a barren sand flat or a mud flat or an algae bed, as you see here pictured on the right. And these shifts are not just ecological; they undermine fisheries, tourism, and shoreline resistance, all costs that we'll explore later on. And so I do want to get into the ecosystem services that a lot of the ecosystems I talked about earlier provide, and the things that we stand to lose if we lose these environments and if these Sargassum accumulation events just continually keep happening. So first, you lose filtering capacity. A lot of these coastal ecosystems filter pollutants, but when they're smothered by Sargassum, it can decline significantly. Second, shoreline protection weakens. The healthy mangroves, like I mentioned earlier, they buffer storms. And something I didn't mention that I want to mention, I guess, right now is that Sargassum also can bring in a lot of heavy metals, particularly arsenic, and that has been shown to, if the ecosystem survives, right, it can leave behind a lot of arsenic and can impact the growth of coral larvae, for example. And on top of the nutrient loading sediment, on top of the nutrient loading that occurs in the sediment, can lead to anoxic conditions. And then third, of course, carbon sequestration suffers. While the floating sargassum does store some carbon, like I mentioned towards the beginning, its die-off in the coast releases that back very rapidly. It was found that net carbon losses occurs when nearshore sargassum dies. And of course, finally, nursery functions collapse, reduced juvenile populations in these sargassum impacted areas, which has direct implications for fisheries. And then one study noted that if these inundations become reoccurrent, which it seems like they are, nearshore ecosystems will be put under much stress with detrimental consequences. And the study highlighted loss of biodiversity among 20 plus seagrass and mangrove communities. So, and how does this impact our shorelines and our beaches physically? So it does it in a few multiple ways. The first one that I really want to get into, besides the ones I mentioned earlier about losing the ecosystems, is that the very act of removing the sargassum from the beach can remove sand, which can accelerate erosion in places like Barbados. Significant changes in beach slope have been observed. If you use heavy machinery, which in some cases, especially in the hotspots, which I'll get into later, like in the Mexican Caribbean, you need to use heavy machinery for cleanup, or at least to clean up the sheer amount of it. And these bulldozers can compact the sand, make it harder for sea turtles to nest, potentially crushing sea turtle nests and other organisms on the beach. And then additionally, when left on the shore, it can leach organic matter and other like heavy metals and arsenic within 24 to 48 hours, which can change the composition of coastal sediments. As it decomposes both in the near shore and on the beach, it buries the light carbonate sands that are typical of Caribbean beaches, shifting the grain size from coarser to finer. And this has been documented in studies on the Mexican Caribbean. But most critically, all these effects combined with the potential loss of the ecosystems reduces natural coastal protection. And with narrower beaches and altered sediments, communities face greater risk from storms and flooding, and the damage compounds with each inundation event. Additionally, the altered grain size composition reduces or shifts the natural wave breaks, which can create a feedback loop that can accelerate further changes in sediment and maybe even habitat loss. It can change the mineral composition of seafloor substrates. Beach erosion and shoreline retreat have been reported for the Mexican Caribbean, up to an over 50% decrease in beach volume. And but how does this impact the benthic marine life itself as well? It can have cascading impacts through the ecological changes I mentioned earlier, but also the physical ones that I mentioned in the previous slide. These physical changes can directly impact burrowing organisms, as many species are adapted to the coarser sand. And in this new, looser environment, a few opportunistic species that prefer those grains can benefit and outcompete. And so this shift to finer sediments can create two compounding problems. Reduced porosity leads to less oxygen circulation, which favor less oxygenated or hypoxic conditions. Compacted areas become unsuitable for many filter feeders and burrowers. That word I struggle with, burrowers. But ultimately, the loss it's a loss of biodiversity. And study shows that declines in abundance and species richness of benthic communities following repeated sargassum inundations. And then organisms that feed on these coastal sediments either disappear or must relocate. And then the last slide for the biophysical impacts, something that I learned relatively recently, is that these sargassum mats, and it seems like algae in general have high retention rates, especially for microplastics, but in particular for microfibers, which can become trapped in their biomass. And so this creates a kind of transport pipeline, from moving microplastics, offshore to nearshore ecosystems carrying a concentrated load of microplastics to vulnerable coastal ecosystems like the mangroves and seagrass that I mentioned earlier. And the implications are very concerning. because these nearshore areas are nursery habitats typically. And so we're seeing sargassum potentially delivering microplastics into the food chain of juvenile fish and other sensitive organisms. And I think this really adds another layer to the impacts of sargassum, not just the visible mass we see on the beach, but invisible microplastic pollution being introduced into these critical ecosystems. I'm quickly moving on to the socioeconomic impacts of sargassum accumulation events, starting off with public health. So as the sargassum decomposes, I mentioned this towards the beginning, it releases hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, toxic gases, smells like rotten eggs, and can cause respiratory issues, headaches, nausea for coastal residents, tourists, and workers. But the risk don't stop there. I mentioned earlier that sargassum contains high levels of heavy metals and especially arsenic, which if left to decompose can contaminate the nearshore, the groundwater, or the food chains. Direct skin contact causes skin rashes and irritation, especially for the cleanup crews and swimmers, but especially the cleanup crews I've seen, since they are in the thick of it, picking it up and being there for long periods of time. And as we saw earlier, it's also a microplastic vector that can likely have it, enter our seafood. But what does this mean for communities? It means that there's short-term health crises during the influx events, long-term exposure, potential exposure to arsenic bioaccumulation, and then economic strain from those medical costs. In particular, the University Hospital Martinique, they showed that patients exposed to sargassum piles complained of non-specific neurological, digestive, respiratory, ocular, and psychological disorders. Moving on to tourism, I think this is one of the biggest ones, considering that the Caribbean especially is, I believe, I read this somewhere, the most dependent region on tourism, and Sargassum Inundation deliver a triple blow to coastal tourism. First, the obvious loss of aesthetic beauty. Pristine beaches buried under meters of rotting seaweed repels people. And then if it's posted on social media, it leads to negative perceptions. Secondly, the loss of recreational opportunities. Swimming, snorkeling, and even diving can become unpleasant or even impossible when the waters are choked with sargassum. And then third, as we've seen earlier, biodiversity can decline. So fewer fish, dead corals, degraded seagrass, loss of mangroves, diminishes the attractions that draw ecotourists. And the economic ripple effects can be severe. I saw studies show that showed up to a 9% reduction in tourist arrivals up to 8 months after a sargassum incident. And so for many island nations, this is not just an environmental issue. It's an existential threat to their largest economic sector. And apologies, 1 second, I need to drink some more. Quickly moving on to the economic impacts. This one is a bit hard to quantify. I think this is the most multifaceted because it impacts, so many areas. So it's complex, but I'll like to go over cleanup as it's likely the easiest to quantify. I saw a study show that in 2018, Mexico spent $17 million to remove 500,000 tons from its coast, and then in 2019 it cost another 2.6 million to clear 85,000 tons. And so that includes, labor, machinery, worker wages, and the logistics. And one thing is that these influxes of sargassum are unpredictable. We don't yet have like a robust prediction mechanism. And so so when these events occur, and if they're at such a large, they can be such large scale that it can force nations and organizations to use their emergency budgets, which can divert funds from other critical projects. And also that unpredictability creates kind of like a paradox or just issues for trying to create businesses and supply chains around sargassum. Because if it's not a consistent coming in, then it's hard to create a supply chain that, creates jobs for people without it being more consistent. And the real big challenge here, especially in quantification of the economic impact, is that the numbers I gave you were only cleanup numbers. They don't account for the drop in tourism, the impacts to fisheries, or the long-term ecological damage. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah. Quickly move on to fisheries. And this one's really quick because the next slide has to do a lot of fisheries as well, but from a different perspective. And so the impacts of fisheries can be quite straightforward, I like to say, is that, you know, fishermen have seen increased time spent at sea to maneuver around seaweed mats. And this is all on top of the ecological things that I mentioned earlier. So that's why I'm not mentioning those, because I feel like I've harped on them too much at this point. But it can damage fishing equipment, sargassum, and vessels due to entanglement. Catches also change in size, in composition across the Caribbean due to these influxes, corrosion from the sulfide, and then, you know, again, the loss of those ecosystem engineers, you know, corals and sea wrasse. Moving on, and this is a big slide. I might take a little too long to explain this. This is something that I found while researching a little bit more in depth of the socioeconomic impact. And I found this study from Barbados talking about the concept of a socio-ecological system. So instead of looking at this issue and issues in general that are impacted in this way, or similar issues, I should say, you can look at it through, instead of the lens of socioeconomics, you can look at it through the lens of socio-ecological systems. You know, and they use the concept of resilience, which is taken here in this case, is taken to be the ability of the socio-ecological system to absorb a environmental shock or disturbance while retaining its essential characteristics. And sorry, but I didn't explain really quickly, is that an example of a socio-ecological system is this figure 5 up here, you know, showing that there's fishermen, the boat captains, the owners of the boats, and then they give it to a vendor, a scaler, a processor, and then they give it to that entity, then gives it to, you know, restaurants, other processors, or even customers. So it's like this chain of people that depend on the fisheries, or on this, for this specific example, on fisheries. And so again, I want to go over the resilience. Resilience seems to be the ability of these systems to absorb, or this system in particular, to absorb an environmental shock while retaining its essential characteristics, which is the capacity of it to self-organize and the capacity of it to facilitate learning, adaptation, and capacity building in the face of these disruptions, right? And they talk about these environmental disruptions affecting the attributes of this group, and they regard it as alterations in capital, you know, that affect the natural, financial, build, human, and social capital of these stakeholders involved in the socio-ecological system. And this to me underlines the interrelatedness among the various types of capital available to these stakeholders, and the snowball effect that a loss of capital, be it economic, social, or otherwise, has on their chain and their work. And so they base this SES on the fisheries sector, as I mentioned earlier, and you know, and they also talk about, if these inundations persist beyond normal seasonal, they can push these systems to past their ability to adapt. You know, on the bottom you have here something they call absorptive coping capacity, basically like how much can they cope, how much can they persist with these events, then their adaptive capacity, how can they adjust within their lane, how can they adjust themselves to cope, and then their transformative capacity. Okay, will they have to change, or will they change entirely their job or whatever they do in the face of these ecological disruptions? And you know, they also talk about how these these fishermen and folks, you know, show adaptive capacity, you know, as they modify boat engines and they seek alternative ways to operate in Sargassum, showing those incremental adjustments. But you know, but there's also this transformative capacity that I mentioned earlier, that businessmen, entrepreneurs, and likely people in the fishery sector are looking at Sargassum as a new way to create, as a new industry, or at least potential to create a new industry around it. And that the true resilience test comes when all these stressors and multiple stressors combine, and fishermen maybe have to sell their boats or migrate temporarily and things like that. And I think in general, to round this discussion out, is that this framework threshold, you know, I think helps explain why some of these communities can recover while others collapse under similar sargassum pressures. Because it's not just about the volume of sargassum coming in, it's how those events interact with pre-existing vulnerabilities in the socio-ecological system. I could talk about this all day, so I'm going to move on. Quickly, this is the last slide for this section. I found this study very important or important to highlight, because it's one of the few studies looking at it from the socio-economic point of view and combining that with the ecosystem impacts. And so the study, first of all, I want to introduce the figure. The figure here on the right has A, which is the combined economic and socioeconomic vulnerabilities. You have B, which is just the vulnerability of the sargassum in terms of the ecosystems. And then C is the vulnerability of sargassum accumulation events on the socioeconomic. And so based on the combined socioeconomic and ecosystem impacts, this study identified 3 primary vulnerable hotspots for sargassum accumulation events. And they mentioned the Mexican Caribbean, the northern Lesser Antilles, and the eastern Greater Antilles. And they said that, these areas face compounding pressures, both ecological and economic. The study also mentions that windward coasts prove significantly more vulnerable than leeward ones, likely due to the currents and the geomorphology. In Africa, they also included Africa, and in Africa, Guinea shows mainly ecosystem vulnerability, while Ghana faces combined ecological and socioeconomic pressures. But the research in the study also acknowledges the limitations that they have. Current models don't capture fine-scale coastal dynamics that affect stranding patterns, factors like waves, tides, local geomorphology that determines ultimately where the sargassum accumulation ends up. And so, they call for better monitoring, shelf transport, and coastal hydrodynamics, which could improve future predictions. And one of their key findings that I thought was interesting was that they showed that the Dominican Republic and the Mexican Caribbean and the Bahamas face the heaviest loads of sargassum, with over 300,000 tons annually reaching the shore. And I think this study proves to be a crucial baseline for understanding the regional vulnerability patterns that sargassum presents. And I'm going to end the section ending this presentation is ways that we can respond politically, economically, and socially. Starting off politically, I think that the sargassum crisis demands urgent policy action at multiple levels of government. Current approaches are mainly just reactive. We need more forward-looking strategies that address the root causes rather than just symptoms. First, comprehensive new policies should be developed specifically for the Sargassum Inundation events. These should include standardized monitoring systems, coordinated response protocols, and dedicated funding mechanisms for impacted communities. And then second, policymakers at all levels, even in regions that are not impacted by sargassum, need to tackle the underlying drivers, right? That means reducing nutrient pollution or agricultural runoff that fuels the balloons likely, and reducing the carbon footprint of the planet in general to mitigate global warming. And this also requires integrating the sargassum management into broader climate adaptation plans, since warming waters and changing currents are exacerbating this issue. And so the key is multi-level coordination. You need to have local authorities, local governments managing beach cleanups with support from their national governments, and have national governments and international partnerships to address the transboundary nature of this crisis. The policy solutions have to match the scale of the challenge. And quickly moving on to economically, how can we respond? And so this, I think, is the most exciting part, or the most exciting part to people in general for sargassum, because you see here pictured on the right, I found the first vehicle powered by sargassum biofuel. And so, I talked about creating supply chains and industries around sargassum, and this is one of the ones that I've seen come up the most is, creating sargassum biofuel, and in general, repurposing sargassum as a bioresource. The second one, or moving on, the process, you can process sargassum, can show promise for agricultural uses like fertilizer and livestock feed. Obviously, you need to take care of the heavy metals issue, and like microplastic issue, well, it's different. And then secondly, You can also convert it into potentially biodegradable packaging materials, which supports a more circular economy that reduces plastic waste, that helps with the microplastics. And then lastly, developing these supply chains for all these different industries that could come out could create jobs for coastal communities, from harvesting to processing to delivering. But the key challenge here really does remain, like I alluded to earlier, is scaling these solutions cost effectively while ensuring environmental and public health safety, with all the issues of heavy metals and stuff. And last slide, socially, how can we approach this from a social point of view and help? So communities are they can lead frontline responses through citizen science. They can create programs that train volunteers or have volunteers monitor sargassum arrivals, which can create more data and just early warning. A thing that I want to highlight is Caricus, pictured here on the lower left. Caricus is the Caribbean Coastal Ocean Observing System, and they created this program called CERCA, which is Coastal and Aquatic Risk Education Centers. It's a program that they have active in 2 schools, which give kids access to publications, guides, and theses, all that Caricus makes. They can teach children, how to use the products on the Caricus webpage, and they can teach them fundamentals about the physical oceanography stuff and maybe even some of the bio stuff, like waves, winds, currents, and the sargassum. I know Caricus does a lot of sargassum work, or they have the sargassum tracker on their webpage. But critically, most of these programs can also, or at least in general, we can integrate local knowledge, likely from these fishermen, through calling back to the socio-ecological system and their ability to adapt and have adaptive capacity. That can be shared and taught to other people. And so, this type of grassroots science can complement official research that can build capacity overall for entire groups in the Caribbean and West Africa. And the ability to be resilient and have the adaptive transformative capacity to share can help deal with these sargassum inundation events. And quickly before I end, I did want to highlight one impact that I didn't mention earlier, is that a sargassum event that occurred, I believe, in the U.S. Virgin Islands broke a desalination plant, which caused a state of emergency because, that particular island, and I believe it was, I'm blanking on the name, St. Croix maybe, lost its ability to produce, water for its residents. And so, they're not the only island that uses those desalination plants. And so, it just highlights that this sargassum can impact more than just ecology, But overall, thank you so much for listening to me. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or email me. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm going to go back to the meeting here.
Thank you very much, Jose. We have a handful of questions in the chat already for you. So Max and I are going to go ahead and read those out one at a time for you to answer, but I do encourage others to please put your questions in there, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. So first question, Jose, and you went over this early on in your presentation. How do sargassum inundations shift sediment grain size, or is this mainly a result of sargassum removal, including sand?
So this is probably one of the things that I learned most recently, so apologies if I can't really fully explain it, but the way I look at it is that, sargassum decomposes and gets buried, and so that takes the place on top of the sediments that are already there. And just the sheer amount that comes in, like the picture here that Max has, not all of that's going to get cleaned up, or maybe not all of that even gets cleaned up at all, and so it can just land on top, especially in the near shore as well, not just in the near shore, but on the beach as well. And so it just adds like a layer on top, especially if the areas are constantly inundated every year, as we've seen in multiple places across the Caribbean. So that hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Max, do you want to ask the next one?
Sure, yeah. Here's another question coming from the UK. So we're coming international on this one. asking about an explanation for the higher level of arsenic in the Sargassum mats. So chemistry, hopefully, right up your alley.
Another one that I'm probably not super vested in, but I've read and it's documented heavily that it's a heavy metal transport, but in particular high in arsenic for probably whatever reason. Maybe it has to do with its biology or just being out in the open ocean and maybe the biology that surrounds it. But I really can't give a concrete answer on that. Would love to follow up though. I would, love to research that really quick. But I imagine it has to do with its biology, and I study chemical oceanography. Apologies.
Thank you, Jose. Next question. This person actually just would love if you could repeat the cleanup costs from Mexico, and maybe
Oh,
if you could either that or put them in the chat. I can put them in the chat too if you send them to me, and
I,
we can always
I
follow
remember
up.
them. It was,
Okay.
I believe it was 2018. It was $17 million for 500,000 tons. I believe that was from a study I think done by Chavez in 2020. I can maybe even send it to you, or email me and I can send it to you. And then the other one was in 2019 was another 85 million for, or no, 85,000 tons and two something million, 2.6 million. It costs a lot of money, and honestly, I've heard reports as well that like the hotels do a lot of cleanup and they're mad at Mexico for not providing enough help. So that's another dynamic that occurs, is that these hotels, they technically own the land, and so the onus is kind of on them to clean up a little bit, but then they complain about the government, which like there are levels to that, and so there's a lot of cleanup costs that occur, and so it can vary wildly depending on how much the wages, I imagine, are probably some of the biggest costs. It's just paying those people to go out there.
Awesome. Yeah. I have read that in Mexico there were efforts to have like appropriated funds, I guess, in these particular regions, specifically for cleanup. Okay.
I mean, that goes back
Another,
to the political. Sorry.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's all interesting discussion. Another question, are fisheries disaster declarations a possible way to support communities experiencing fishery impact from sargassum inundation events, associated brown tides?
I'm not familiar with what a fisheries disaster declaration is. Can any of you speak to me on what that might look, or what that looks like? Is it like a state of emergency for like a certain fishery, and then like
Yeah,
certain policies?
it's a formal declaration that I think governors and other leaders in certain areas can request of NOAA, and then NOAA Fisheries will review it. And then I believe the declaration is made by the Secretary of Commerce. So um, I guess if the Sargassum Inundation event meets the criteria for a disasters declaration, it could be made. I'm not familiar with the process, and I don't know if it's ever been done for Sargassum in particular.
Yeah, I don't see that, because it's so varied and it impacts such a wide area, that I don't see that being a vehicle that will be used by the government, at least in the foreseeable future. If the issue becomes more and more and more, which we have seen that its influx has been increasing, not every year on year, but like we see a general increase here and there every few years, and so maybe, but we wait and see. I would say.
All right, let's look at the next question. So this question is about the economic opportunity that sargassum may pose. This person is wondering how it can be a stable economic opportunity if it relies on an unpredictable phenomenon.
You create a
It's a good
prediction
question.
mechanism. You create a robust prediction mechanism is what you want to do. And I believe, if you really want to get more in detail about it, like satellites are limited by cloud cover, especially in the Caribbean. And so you would want likely maybe drones and stuff like that, just surveying areas constantly and getting more granular with your observations. I'm also not a physical oceanographer, so I don't know what the mechanisms and the specifics are for predicting, the currents, because that's what's ultimately going to bring in your sargassum, is your currents. And so you would need more just robust prediction, and maybe a variable like processing system where like, okay, this year we don't expect much, so we're not going to hire that many people, or we're going to adjust our processing facility to work at 50% capacity, stuff like that. Like, but that does have an implication on, oh, I expected to have a job this summer. Why am I not having a job this summer? And so, it's tricky, and that's ultimately the one of the biggest issues of creating a supply chain or a business centered around sargassum is how can you support, and also like if you can't process the 100% of sargassum that comes in, you're leaving some of it out. What happens to that that's left out? Things like that. Like there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered that I, in particular, can't answer because, that's just a business venture, and you would need to create innovative ideas at that point that I think need to be that are novel at that point, or that would be novel. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. If sargassum is being converted into biofuel, aren't the microplastics also being burned in the combustion of the fuel? Or is it or I guess the question is asking about the processing. It depends on, or is it separated before it is turned into the fuel?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. Again, one of the things I found out recently was the microplastic factor thing. So as far as I understand, is the nature of the biology of the algae, because in the study they also mentioned that other algae like alga and stuff like that are also microfiber carriers, especially. It was like 80% microfibers, and so it's essentially like polyester and things like that are getting stuck in sargassum. So I would say yes, it is likely getting burned, but I imagine the engineers that create the combustion engine either know that, or it's such a small amount, technically, once you distill the sargassum, into a biofuel, I imagine, you're losing a lot of its mass or its components. And so maybe part of that is a loss in microplastics in processing. I'm not exactly sure how they process it for biogas. Again, I can definitely look into that. I just wanted to round out the presentation with ways that we can, with some positivity, rather than just all the negative of the impact. So,
Um,
yeah.
Josie, really quick, there was a comment saying that the sargassum latches onto the arsenic instead of phosphate, and I remember this, I think, from the workshop we had, because uh, a lot of these areas where the sargassum's forming and coming in are nitrogen enriched, right? So they're phosphate limited, right? So now they're latching onto that arsenic in place, um, and that's why. So
Oh,
I'm gonna say that one's answered for now.
wow. That's honestly, I guess arsenic and phosphorus are similar structures or similar in terms of their chemical makeup. I forget where arsenic lands in the periodic table. My bad.
Thanks for that insight, Max. Good memory from the workshop.
That's actually really interesting. That answered my question about that.
Um, Another question from the audience, and this one's pretty general. Do you have any thoughts on sinking sargassum in the deep ocean as sort of a management strategy or disposal strategy?
I think it could be viable, but I think that would lead to coastal, or not coastal sediment. That would lead to the benthic area, the benthic sediment to change. And so how does that impact the few, but the organisms that exist on there, or even the ones that are at the bottom? It would depend on how far offshore, what is being impacted, like, how would that, you would need to study the long-term impacts of that, because I don't want to say it's similar to like deep sea mining or anything, or like MCDR, but it can have implications on like an ocean-wide basis, depending on at the scale at which we do it as well, is also a factor. Like the scale, like you can do it maybe in patches, and it wouldn't maybe impact much, but like, if we're trying to use it as a mechanism of like MCDR, then like, it would be wide scale, and at that point you're shifting the sediment structure or the sediment style. I don't know exactly how to say it, but the types of sediments we see now in the deep sea environment. So I would say hesitantly to maybe no, because of the impacts. I would say study it. I would say, it's a great master's thesis, maybe, or a PhD probably, because it involves a lot. Going out to the deep ocean, you need more funding for that. So, but yeah, great question. Honestly, I thought about that too.
A quick question here about other potential industrial uses. I think you mentioned biofuels, but anything else to sort of highlight for the
Oh,
group?
I think me. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Bio. I think it said fertilizer, which again, but then cows and stuff are eating it, so you have to treat it and at least take out the arsenic, microplastics. Well, it's in the air too, so and microplastics talking about. The other one I believe was, hold on, let me pull up the slides. Packing materials. That's the one I think would be the most useful, because it's humans don't eat packing material. We don't fuel our cars with packing material. We use plastic, which is already not the greatest thing to use as packing material. And so I believe most of the microplastics that we see out in the ocean and in general are from packing materials and like packaging and stuff like that. So moving towards a more sustainable packaging mechanisms would be the most beneficial of Sargassum, and maybe even the fertilizer. But again, you'd have to treat it and things like that. So I think the packing material is the coolest one. Oh, and charcoal bricks, like for cooking your food, but that also you're eating it, so kind of. So I didn't mention that one, but I've seen people talk about turning them into charcoal bricks. I guess you can use it to burn other things. So.
Thank you, Jose. I actually have a question of my own that I would like to ask. So, given your current role working in the House of Representatives, I was wondering what opportunities you see for federal policy to influence the management of sargassum accumulation events. And I know you went over some broad options in your presentation, but if you had to pick one and you think that this will be super impactful from the federal level, what would you choose?
I would say I would adjust, and I'm talking from, and this is going to be a broad double policy-wise, but it's going to be more granular, and I think this is going to answer your question, is that you would want to change the policy around how it's classified in water, because I believe that you don't want it to reach shores, right? And I think picking it up in the offshore is your best bet to mitigate the impacts that I talked about here, but then it's an essential fish habitat in the water, right? And so that comes with a degree of protection. You need a permit to pick it up. You need all these things. Which, yeah, you can get your permit, sure. But if we want to do it at a large scale, I think you need to create some type of federal management plan or policy around at what point is it too much of a nuisance, or is it too big that when it is going to come offshore, we need to collect it. And so I've seen booms and barriers that can pull the sargassum before it reaches the nearshore ecosystem, and then people can come and collect it. And I think creating a policy centered around that to mitigate the impact of once it reaches the shores, especially, from the U.S., that could be a great policy that other nations can follow potentially, or create a multi-level nation response, which I think would be the best way to do that. But that would take a level of international collaboration that I don't think is typical around these types of issues.
Well, thank you so much. That's a great answer, and I'll say I agree. And with that, we are at the end of our hour. I want to thank you, Jose, for taking this time and presenting to us on your knowledge of sargassum policy and interface with coastal ecosystems. I did put your email in the chat, so if we did not get to your questions, please feel free to reach out either to SECART or to Jose, and we'll try to get your answers or your questions answered. And with that, say goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Next week, we're going to be talking about methods currently being used to address sargassum inundations in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we're going to be building sort of on some of the things that we talked about here. So be sure to register.
Bye,
Okay,
everybody.
thank you all.